Joining me today and presenting for us is our subject matter expert, Michael Zadravec. He's a Search and Rescue Coordination Officer with the Joint Rescue Coordination Centre based in Canberra. And I thank Michael for his time and the knowledge that he passes on to us today. G'day, Michael.
G'day, Shaun. Thanks for the warm introduction. I'll just quickly introduce myself while I got the chance. I've been at AMSA now for 2 years as part of the Aviation Search and Rescue team. And about 10 years prior to that, I flew in the Air Force in maritime surveillance missions on board the AP3C Orion and the PA Poseidon. Thanks, Shaun. Back to you.
Thanks very much, Michael. Before we continue further, I'd like to take a moment just to respectfully acknowledge the traditional custodians and knowledge holders of the lands we meet on today, their continuing connection to land, water and community. I pay respect to elders past, present and emerging, and I would like to extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who are in attendance today. I'd also like to let you know that as part of attending our AvSafety webinars, you will receive a Credly digital badge recognizing your commitment to continuous learning. All you need to do today is stay for the duration of the webinar and look, your microphones are off, your cameras are off, so that can be in any capacity. Kick back, relax and enjoy the information that we have to cover today. So what we'll be talking about, I'll be handing over to Michael very shortly, and he's going to take us through the Joint Rescue Communication Coordination Centre and what the JRCC actually does. We'll talk a bit about SARTIMEs and managing SARTIME, what happens in the background with the JRCC, also when ELTS are activated as well. And then I've also grabbed a case study that's reasonably recent from late 2022, which relates to the use of SARTIMEs and activation of ELTS. And we can have a look at some of the learning opportunities from that case study as well. Handing over to you, Michael. Thank you.
Thank you, Shaun. All right, so our first topic today, just a real quick introduction about the JRCC itself, or the Joint Rescue Coordination Centre. We live within AMSA itself, so it's a quick history lesson here. 1st of July of 97, we were previously known as AUSTAR, or the Australian Search and Rescue Coordination. And we commenced operations as integrated both aviation and maritime agency. So today we're known as the JRCC Australia, and we do operate 24/7 from our new AMSA Response Centre here in Canberra. As well as the aviation theme that I'll be talking about today, we do quite a lot of stuff on the other side of it, including Maritime Assistance Services, or MAS, also domain awareness, MSI, or maritime safety information, and our maritime team do a lot of triaging as well. But today we'll be dealing with all the aviation side of it. Just real quick before we get into SARTIMEs themselves, just within the National SAR arrangement, there is only 3 authorities that can run search and rescue responses. So firstly, there's us here within the JRCC Australia at AMSA, and we're responsible for all registered civil aircraft and all distress beacons that come through. So that's the part that we'll be talking about today. Otherwise, state and territory police do quite a bit on their side, especially with land searching and all unregistered civil aircraft. So if you have a gyrocopter or powered paragliders, but often they come to us for assistance as well. And then defence, the third stakeholder, and they deal with all their own aircraft, vessels and people. One point I'd like to point out here is that there is a stakeholder that is missing that was previously a stakeholder in 97. So that's air traffic control, and that is quite important, which I'll discuss in a later slide. So starting off with SARTIME, so our first discussion piece today. So I'd like to start with the management of the SARTIME itself, and then in importance, cancelling at the end of the flight is the critical responsibility of the pilot in command. This is just to ensure that both air services and us, so as an emergency response authority, know that you've just arrived safely. So that's as simple as it gets. And for us too, we see it as if you can, it can prevent unnecessary search and rescue operations, which can be at times highly resource intensive. and at times a costly process. So next, I'd like to talk about the statistics around SARTIMEs themselves. So last year, there were approximately 8,000 SARTIMEs, or roughly 22 per day, that did expire without them being cancelled by pilots themselves or the pilot in command. So around 1 in 25 of those do get passed to us in the JRCC from air services when pilots are unable to be contacted by air services themselves. So the transfer of responsibility to us usually occurs within the 30 minutes after a nominated expired SARTIME. So, and a point to note to make here is that Sensar can be quite busy. So if they don't answer your phone call the first time, please continue trying to reach someone. Otherwise, they will activate a phase and pass that to us within that 30 minutes. Shaun, I'll hand you back to you real quick just to comment on your preferred method of cancelling.
So I'd just like to note before I talk about that, Michael, that sometimes if you have difficulty getting hold of Sensar, it may be because they are doing some work in the background to contact some of these aircraft and some of these overdue SARTIMEs. So even having the overdue SARTIME can clog up the system a little bit. Preferred method of cancelling SARTIME, which is explained in the AIP in the en route section. Preferred for SARTIME is to cancel over the phone to Sensar. Second preferred is to use NAMES functionality through the internet to cancel your SARTIME. And then third, which is still a viable option if that's the only thing that's available to you, is you can cancel over VHF with ATS services.
Thanks, Shaun. So moving on, I'd also like to quickly talk about SARWatch itself as a slight difference to the SARTIME just previously mentioned. So SARWatch, generally IFR. So this is activated when a pilot does fail to make either a position, arrival, or departure report, or it could be a mix of all three. So similar to the SARTIMEs, that transfer responsibility for SAR action to us usually occurs within the 30 minutes after the nominated expired SARWatch. Now, for us here in the centre, we do acknowledge that at 98%, so almost all of them fall under the fail to report arrival category. So arriving at either a controlled or usually a controlled aerodrome. So just a quick tip. So prior to departure, investigate options on how you will look to notify the appropriate authority. And I think, Shaun, you have mentioned the preferred ways to cancel. Like you mentioned, there was a mobile phone is the preference. You may have to run inside to where you land to activate a landline if there's no mobile service there, or a sat phone. And then tertiary would be through VHF, or if you do have a HF fitment to your aircraft, or potentially at the station you're landing at. Shaun, would you like to comment any further on that?
Yeah, so just to add to that tip, it's a fantastic tip. When you're doing your flight planning, have a look ahead and consider, how am I going to cancel my SARTIME or my SARWatch when I arrive at my destination? For the SARWatch, again, with the AIP en route section, ideally over VHF or HF. Secondary, you can call either the Brisbane FIR or Melbourne FIR ATS to cancel that over the phone. If you're not sure where those numbers are located, they're in the Ready Reference Guide in the ERSA, which is one of the very first pages in the ERSA introduction. There's a couple of full reporting numbers there, which you can use if you're cancelling a SARWatch.
Cool, thanks, Shaun. So what I'd like to talk about on this slide is us with the JRCC, what our actions on are when receiving the uncertainty phase. That's what air traffic control will hand us within that 30 minutes of the expired either SARTIME or SARWatch. So firstly, if the controller at a Class G aerodrome has observed you landing and there's no onward sectors, departures, or at tertiary your aircraft is visibly tied down on the apron, then that is the easiest one for us. We can immediately cancel the SARTIME on your behalf. No further action is required. What we'll do next then, though, is we'll attempt to contact the nominated pilot in command. We do have a comprehensive database here of operators, such as flight academies and training schools, transport organisations, and so on. So we'll usually sometimes go through that list itself. Next, we will use satellite ADS-B tracking to an extent, just to see, firstly, if it's within the area where you're expecting to land, or if it's in a completely different area itself, we may need to adjust our operations. Also, we may ask other aircraft, they're in contact with the aerodrome just to check on your arrival. So if we know that they're there, they can do a quick scour around and check if you're there as well. If none of this is successful, though, we'll be moving on to contacting the aerodrome reporting officer or the ARO, and then to the local police if there's no ARO there or available. And then lastly, if none of the above is successful, which does happen maybe for about 10% of the time, the ones that we will investigate to this point, we will look to task a suitably equipped asset. So for us, it's normally a contracted helicopter. And then we do have our 3 Challenger jets around the country, which maybe is used as a last resort, but can be used to this incident. Just like to make a quick note too, linking back to the SAR authorities, noting that ATC were not one of those. They are unable to cancel a phase on your behalf. So noting that first point, that's why they call us and they will give us the information that is, for example, you've landed and you haven't taken off again. They can see aircraft on the strip still. For us, that's the quick confirmation. Yeah, we're happy with that information. We'll cancel a phase. That's what happens there. And a second point I'd like to make just regarding our own database. If you do update your details, so for example, you have a large changeover or phone numbers or chief pilots, instructors, your ops room changes, those kind of things, in your own time, feel free to reach out to us. I'll provide you with the contact details in a couple of slides just to notify us, and that'll help us do some ring arounds if required if this incident does pop up. So next on, this does occur to us too for our own actions on if you're actually airborne. So this would normally occur, for example, if you've had delayed takeoff due weather, maintenance issues. We understand that maybe amending your SAR time at that point is probably the last thing that you're thinking about. So often the SAR time will expire when you're airborne still, haven't reached your destination. So what will occur at this point is we'll request ATC to conduct a broadcast for your call sign, normally on an area frequency, secondary on the 1215 distress frequency, or a tertiary, it could be on the CTAF that you might be known to operating on, or even on multicom. As well as that, the aircraft may also be conducting relays on ATC's behalf. So there could be quite a few comms going around. So for us, the best solution is if you can amend if you're able to be contacted, your SAR time to be amended airborne and then cancelled once again when you're on the ground. So this slide is just a couple of tips and tricks that us here at JRCC I do recommend. Firstly, just to set an alarm or reminder on your phone, or if you use an EFB or a tablet or even a smartwatch to cancel your SAR time. Sometimes you can consider having a step in your shutdown checklist to cancel a SAR time itself. Thirdly, nominate a SAR time no less than an hour or two after you're due to arrive. You don't want to nominate a SAR time. For example, we've had some 10 to 12 maybe they've done the conversion wrong, AM and PM, but 10 to 12 hours post you land, because as a reminder, the SAR time is when search and rescue action will commence. So if that is 12 hours later, worst case scenario, you've come down on a hard landing or unable to call anyone, and you're injured, and no one knows. The only person who will know that you haven't landed is the expired SAR time. Then yeah, please make it within an hour or two after you landed. Just a point here, because this has come up a couple of times lately for us. If you have refiled, say if you're a VFR pilot, but you do have IFR training qualifications, if you do refile IFR airborne and do land at a controlled aerodrome, you still need to cancel your SAR time, as unfortunately those two agencies don't always talk to each other. So that'll be a two-pronged approach there.
Now, just before you...
Oh, sorry, I'll go back a slide. Yep.
Just before you move on to the next slide, thanks, Michael. There's a couple of questions here which I might just address before we move on. The first one, Andre, is there a difference between cancelling SAR time over phone or via NAPES, providing there is plenty of time left before the SAR time expires? Basically, there is no difference. You can cancel your flight plan, your OKO flight notification, or your SAR time notification through NAPES, and that will cancel your SAR time. From Andrew, SARWatch cancelled automatically when cleared to land by tower. Yes, I thought I would just leave that until the end of this slide. Andrew, if you land at a controlled aerodrome, it will be automatically cancelled for an IFR aircraft. But as you can see, if you do have a separate SARTIME, that will need to be cancelled.
Yep.
Robert, for flights landing at remote non-controlled aerodromes and ALAs, is it better to cancel SARWatch as VHF comms are becoming scratchy during descent or by phone after landing? I would recommend via VHF in the circuit area. Otherwise, it would be sensible to phone after landing. You can be in that situation, for example, in some areas of Australia where VHF reception is to ATS cannot be great below 10,000 feet. So it would be better to carry that SARWatch all the way to the landing, give them a call after landing, and give them those details. Iman, I think the name is. I hope I've got that right. I had issues with the Sensar call center, which is 1-800-814-931. Look, that's the only number that's given for contacting Sensar, but you do have another option, and I would recommend contacting the briefing office, which is 1-800-805-150. The reason I say that is because you can submit, change, and cancel a flight notification through the briefing office. They may have a way of getting through to Sensar specifically. Did you want to add anything to that, Michael? Is there another way of getting in touch with Sensar outside of the 1-800 number?
No, and that's for us. Yeah, the 1-800 is the primary, and yes, secondary or the NAPES notification office. I would recommend that also as a secondary. Unfortunately, yeah, sometimes you'd have to keep trying. I can like jump on that. Yeah. Sometimes it does go through to voicemail every time, but sometimes they may be down a couple of operators, or there's quite a few SARTIMEs expiring at the same time. So that's probably potentially why they're unable to pick up your call.
Yes, and I just saw Iman come back. So the briefing office is 1-800-805-150. I can pop that into the chat. There's another couple of questions there, but I think we'll keep moving. Thanks, Michael.
No worries. We'll attack those at the end if we need be. I'll move on to so the second topic. Just going to discuss ELT activations, particularly those that are false or inadvertent, and what happens here in the center. So the first point I'd like to make is that you will not get in trouble if you do accidentally activate your ELT. It does happen quite a lot. So what happens here is we'll receive the beacon alert itself will come through the COSPAS SARSAT system. So if your aircraft is outside and it's not shielded and your ELT is on for more than 5 seconds, what will happen here is we'll get a pretty accurate position to about 120 meters, especially if they're GNSS or if you are carrying a GPS encoded PLB as well, and you have that on or accidentally activate that one, because we understand some people do prefer to fly with PLBs rather than ELTs around the aerodromes. So for us, within the beacon registration form, which we do receive with that beacon activation, so what we'll do here is we'll attempt to contact the registered owner. So that's an important point there, is that might not be whoever who's flying the aircraft at the time. So, or if you've let your registration lapse, sometimes that does occur. That might be the previous owner or someone that's not associated with the aircraft anymore, but usually they're quite helpful in providing those onwards details. For us, then we may proceed on to the next of kin, and if there's any company contacts there, so we'll start working down the list. Again, we may ask overflying aircraft to conduct broadcast views, but if you've turned your radios off or not listening at the time, then you won't be able to hear that, but we'll definitely try that just in case you are listening out or you have it turned up loud. So similar to our SARTIME actions, if nil draw with any of the above actions, then what we may have to do is look at the ARO again, if it is at a controlled or an aerodrome that does have one, or if they're a local police, they can do drive past and access aerodrome itself. And again, moving on to a contracted rescue helicopter or the Challenger itself to do a fly past just to check that the aircraft is there if there's no other way of affirming that you are safe on the ground. And with that, notoriously, good old Robo 22s and 44s We get them 2 to 3 times a week, especially from the mustering group. Understand that they're being washed and cleaned. They are, unfortunately, when they get wet in the tail section, just behind the cockpit there, they will generally activate themselves and give us a pretty good position, normally on a station or normally where you're mustering. For us though, we can assume you're washing aircraft, but in worst cases, sometimes you're not and could be in trouble. So if your phone is ringing while you're either washing the aircraft, please answer it if you can. So for us, as soon as we get that distress beacon through from an ELT, we have to assume it's a distress situation immediately. We can't assume that things will work out for the best. So we need to assume you're in distress until we can prove it otherwise. So the point I'd like to make there, if you do recognize ELT has been activated, please contact us as soon as you can. I'll provide numbers on the next slide. Some other tips that I can quickly add in here, if you do have the wherewithal while you're washing the aircraft, sometimes we do recommend tuning the radio up to 1 to 1.5 on the distress frequency. So if you do hear that distress sound or tone come through the radio, then it's most likely yours if it's very loud and there's no one else in the area. That's just a quick tip if you do have that, but that's not required. As I mentioned, for us here ourselves, the number there in red, that is our aviation phone number. We'll always call you via that phone number itself. So if you can, please take a note to save it into your phone or tablet or whatever you use to navigate with or communicate with. That will be us. It's never a suspect phone call coming from that number. Alternatively, sometimes if that number does go down, then we may send you texts from those 2 numbers there. So if you do have the space in your phone, please just save those 3 numbers into your phone as us. There'll definitely be no scam calls coming from those 3 numbers. And lastly, I'd just like to quickly mention we may actually reach out to you if we do suspect there's a missing or overdue aircraft or potentially a vessel in difficulty in your area. And if you're flying around, we notice that you are via tracking or other means. So potential tasks that we may request at that point, firstly, is to monitor the distress frequency of 1 to 1.5. If you can affirm that you are hearing a tone through that, it is very helpful for us too, especially if we can't get a good satellite lock or a good position update on that beacon. Secondly, it may ask you to conduct broadcasts on an error frequency or ask you to broadcast on other frequencies such as the CTAF or multicom that you're familiar with. A point to note here is that your request to assist is at your discretion, and as pilot command, it's up to you to accept that. You don't have to, but if you can, that'd be very helpful for us. And that may just include just overflying the datum if it's, for example, a mile or 2 off course of where you are. And this has occurred a couple of times lately. If you are flying along the coast, for example, where there's not many other people, and if you notice, as in we've asked you to look out for a stricken vessel, and you do notice that, please report that if you can get or climb high enough to report to ATS, and they'll definitely relay that to us.
Thanks very much.
I'd like to hand back over to you, Shaun, for the case study.
Thanks very much, Michael. There's a couple of extra questions that have just come in that I might just get to before we look at the case study. So,
yeah, sure. Just scrolling back up to have a look.
Phil's asked, is there a difference between VFR and IFR SARTIME? Recently commenced to fly VFR but with a nominated SAR, but changed to IFR mid-flight. Cancelled my SAR with centre via VHF on arrival. So I thought, got a phone call from Sensar. So that's that difference that we're talking about, Phil, between the SAR watch and the SAR time. So picking up the IFR plan, you have an associated SAR watch, which I imagine is what you likely cancelled on arrival, but you still had the existing VFR SAR time, which still needs to go to Sensar to be cancelled.
Yeah, I suspect there that Centre may not have passed that to Sensar, but normally they should. So yeah.
Okay. T Hill, lots of aerodromes. Nobody would know you pranged in the circuit area, and that also goes with another one. Is it desirable from Robert? Is it desirable to keep SAR watch open active until the aircraft has landed so that there's an active SAR watch? Yes, I would certainly recommend that, Robert. So there's three things you can do in this space. You can terminate it on changing to CTAF. As I mentioned, you can terminate in the circuit area, or you can terminate once you have landed, if you are able to. What I would recommend is, if you're not able to prior to changing to CTAF or in the circuit area, it's the best idea to hold that SAR watch until you're on the ground. Basically, ATC will start, I believe it's 10 minutes, Michael, after the aircraft CTA.
Yep, bang on.
They're going to start looking for you, so it would be desirable to keep that until after you land. And as I mentioned, it's a quick call on the phone to either Brisbane or Melbourne FIR to cancel the SAR watch from there. And last one before we move on, we may have to get back to you on this one. This one's from Colin and also from a D Hill. Would SMS be a functionality to have in place rather than calling? That might be something we need to have a chat with Sensar about.
Concur.
And maybe just provide some additional details about what may be occurring in that space. Okay.
Cool.
So as I mentioned in the introduction, I'd like to have a look at a case study which just touches on these areas around holding a SAR time or having a flight plan, a SAR time notification, or having a flight note and having that aircraft equipment fitted to the aircraft as well. So we are going to have a look at an ATSB case study. The purpose of reviewing this case study is not to apportion blame on those involved, but for us to focus on the safety outcomes and the learning opportunities of the occurrence. So this incident occurred in late 2022. It involved a Robinson R-22 helicopter, and this helicopter was operating in the Northern Territory to the east of Darwin in the Arafura Swamp area. Okay. And we'll work through some of the details that were occurring with the flight as we work our way through. So the pilot in command held a commercial pilot license with over 6,200 hours of total aviation experience. So someone who's quite experienced, you could certainly say. And basically the incident flight was at the end of the day of mustering operations, and the flight was basically to ferry the aircraft from the mustering area to the mustering camp, which was only 11 miles to the west of the mustering area. So we're talking quite a short flight, 10 or 15 minute flight. At the end of the day, you would reasonably assume that, you know, nothing too out of the ordinary is probably going to happen to you. But what you're about to see is the outcome of the flight was probably very different to what the pilot was expecting. So the ferry flight was delayed a little at the end of mustering operations. It departed sometime after last light. Last light for the area was 1858 local. Unfortunately, the R-22 collided with terrain at approximately 1925 local on the flight back to the mustering camp. And following the collision, the pilot was able to exit the helicopter. However, due to the pilot's injuries and reduced mobility, they had to remain with the aircraft. So they're unable to seek assistance or move from the area of the accident. Okay. Now, later in the evening, members of the mustering camps recognised that the pilot and the aircraft were missing, and that the pilot may be overdue. So they commenced a land search using vehicles from about 9 p.m. in the afternoon to about 1 a.m. in the morning the following day on the 15th of September. And they were unsuccessful in locating the pilot or the helicopter. So after conducting the search, they also contacted some acquaintances who had helicopters who also attended the area the following day, and they conducted an aerial search from about 11 in the morning. And the accident site was located at 1 p.m. the following afternoon on the 15th of September. and only about 6 kilometres from the mustering camp. So very, very close to the destination, and the accident site was found about 17 and a half, 18 hours after the initial accident. So you can see quite a significant amount of time has lapsed before there was any persons looking for the pilot and the aircraft, and also there was also that period of time, 17 and a half hours, before any authorities were notified that the pilot and the aircraft had been missing. So what did the ATSB find? Well, in their investigation, they found that the pilot of the R-22 operated the helicopter at night in cloudy conditions and away from the direction of sunset. The pilot did not have an appropriate qualification, and the helicopter was not suitably equipped for night flight. So as a result, while flying in dark night conditions, the pilot likely became spatially disorientated, which led to a collision with terrain. Now, also they found that the flight operated in a designated remote area. The pilot did not submit a flight plan or nominate a SARTIME for arrival, or leave a formal flight note, which was a requirement for the flight operating in a designated remote area. When the helicopter didn't return to camp that evening, it was understood by the members of the mustering operation eventually that the pilot was overdue. So there were occasions in previous where the pilot would return to the mustering camp perhaps later than expected, or at a different time than expected. So it wasn't unusual for the aircraft to not be exactly on time back to the camp. And the other thing is that the other camp members weren't aware of some of the aviation systems that are available and the authorities that are contactable. And also in that more remote environment, you tend to work through issues with sort of limited resources in a remote area. So the members of the mustering operation did not contact any authority that night. As I mentioned, it was only after discovering the accident site, some 17 and a half, 18 hours after the accident occurred the following day, they made a call to 000. Okay, now, so we didn't have a SARTIME there to notify any authorities or a responsible person holding a flight note. The helicopter was also fitted with a personal locating beacon, the ACR type. It was basically mounted in the center console of the helicopter. Now, the pilot did not activate the personal locator beacon, which was probably inaccessible to the pilot once they left the helicopter after the accident. And the other thing is it would have been probably quite dark and quite difficult to locate and activate that PLB. So a little bit different to the automatic ELT that might be fitted to an aircraft that may be activated by a certain G loading. The PLB, slightly different, that it needs to be physically activated by the pilot. Now, unfortunately, due to the authorities not being notified that the aircraft was missing, and also due to the ELT not being activated, although the pilot survived the initial accident, they did unfortunately succumb to environmental exposure whilst waiting to be found by the mustering party. So certainly something we can see which could have been preventable in what we're talking about today by having some relatively straightforward assistance with the SARTIME and with using the ELT effectively. So what are some lessons for us all here? I think we should just address the initial area of operating the aircraft at night. If you're flying an aircraft, day visual flight rules, then in the flight planning stages, we need to be making sure that we're arriving at least 10 minutes before the end of daylight to ensure that daylight's going to be sufficient. And we need to factor in things like terrain and weather and cloud cover and how that might affect the natural light. And we also need to plan for unforeseen contingencies that might be possible. I know that it might be difficult to plan for, but these may occur during the flight. We need to understand how that affects the flight as well. From a search and rescue perspective in the planning stages, it's also important to think about what kind of terrain are you going to be crossing, not only for your remote area requirements, but also think about, in a worst case scenario, how difficult it might be to find an aircraft in that area. So also think about, when you're planning, what sort of areas should I be flying across, or is there some more hospitable areas that I could potentially use as well? Now, when you're operating on a flight, I think it's quite important to always tell someone what you are doing. Okay. A lot of the time, particularly with our legislative requirements, a VFR flight by day that's a private operation is not required to have a full flight plan, a SAR notification, or a flight note where you're operating wholly in Class G airspace. So this is something that's really important to think about, and we're starting to get into that safety beyond compliance. What is going to help me be safer with my operation? So always tell someone what you're doing. Consider submitting the full flight plan or a SARTIME notification in NAIPS, or you can leave a flight note with a responsible person. And it's important to understand that when you do leave a flight note with a responsible person, that person does need to meet requirements, which are detailed in the regulations as well, which we'll talk about in a moment. So that responsible person does need to be at least 18 years of age. They do need to have 2 separate methods of contacting a SAR authority. So that could be a landline and a mobile, or 2 separate mobiles, okay? They also need to satisfy the pilot and command that they understand how to contact the JRCC in the event that the flight is missing or late and delayed after the intended arrival time. So that's quite an important point as well. I'd like to also talk about the ELT and carrying suitable aircraft equipment. So yes, there are certain occasions where an ELT may not be required, but for the most part, the aircraft should be fitted with an automatic ELT or carry a PLB. Know how and when to operate the equipment as well, okay? If you're in a distress situation, certainly that's a great opportunity to utilize the ELT. Yes, we can conduct radio calls on frequencies, but we can also utilize that ELT as well. If you're carrying a PLB, carry it on your person, because we can see in the case study that we spoke about, although it met the requirements and it was adjacent to an emergency exit, it was something that was missed after the accident had occurred. So there is some benefits in carrying a PLB somewhere on your person or in your flight bag or in something that you're going to take with you in that situation. As I discussed, with operating in remote areas and designated remote areas, there are some requirements around carrying additional survival equipment, and that you need to carry survival equipment for sustaining life as appropriate for the remote area to be overflown. I know that's quite broad. We'll talk about that in a moment. But when we are carrying that survival equipment in the designated remote area, it's important to think about carrying some location or some signaling equipment in that survival equipment as well. And that can be some of the information that's detailed in the OSA emergency section. So what I'm talking about is things like a heliograph or a signal mirror, day flares, night flares, strobes and electric torches, large signal panels. If we're talking about overwater operations, potentially CDI markers, even things that can start, that can be an improvised aid, like starting a signal fire as well, are all effective signaling tools that are available to you. So those are some things to consider. Lastly, I'd just like to touch on it briefly. Consider carriage of a satellite phone. I know they're not the cheapest item out there. If that's not doable, then newer models of iPhones, certainly the iPhone 14 onwards, has an emergency SOS via satellite feature. So it will connect you to emergency services via satellites when you're outside of cellular range. I'm not sure about Android devices. That's probably something that, if you're interested in, would be worth looking into, and whether it's something that you feel would be a viable option. There is more capability separate to having a full-blown satellite phone. Now, where can we find some of this information and some of these requirements? Now, the requirements for each item are quite expansive, and it would take us quite a bit of time to really work through what all of the requirements are. So I've got some areas here on this page that I'd just like to talk through. So in terms of the flight planning requirements, hopefully everyone is familiar with ARP en route 1.10 flight planning for submitting flight notifications, and also en route 1.1 paragraph 10.2, which is where it talks about SAR watch and SAR time and the methods for cancelling both of those. Using the CASA VFRG Visual Flight Rules Guide, you have Chapter 2, Planning Your Flight. There's a lot of information there about flight notification requirements. And Chapter 7, Dealing with Emergency Situations. So we're talking about survival equipment, using your ELT and ELT requirements for aircraft. And we also have that information in the Part 91 Plain English Guide, Chapter 10 for flight notifications, and Appendix A for aircraft equipment and remote areas. When you're looking at the Visual Flight Rules Guide and the Plain English Guide, if you're interested in having a look in the Manual of Standards for Part 91, or if you're interested in having a look at the regulations, it will give you the details for those regulations. If you're an air transport flight, then there's going to be slightly different requirements in your associated regulations for helicopter for 133 and aircraft for 135 and 121. So that is the end of the content that we're going to cover today. Now, what I'd like to do is just jump back into the questions here and see if there's a few more questions we can answer before our time finishes today.
Yeah, Shaun, I took the wherewithal to answer a couple while you were going through the case study there. And I guess I was just typing up one there with Mitchell. We do, I guess the only disadvantage I'll have on that last one is Zoleo and Garmin and all the rest of they're getting quite popular now, do go through a third party with their activation, but that gets passed to us immediately. So I guess the only disadvantage is it might be slightly more like an extra minute or two in terms of getting to us through direct, or at least to an agency that can enact search and rescue. But we see great advantages for those devices for sure.
Now, did you see Cale Overton's question, Michael?
Yes, I replied to, so I'm just scrolling back up. I did talk to Cale, yeah, and Peter, Philip, Mitchell, talked to Robert. Going back to the list, Andre and DeHill, and then I talked to Mitchell. Yeah, okay. True, Mohammed. Yep. So Android has, yep, emergency SOS as well as the iPhone. Nice one. Yep, that's to the bottom of the list. That's all I've got at this stage. And then the last one, do it over satellite. I believe yes, it does it over satellite. That capability there, DeHill. So yeah, it does. What we've noticed is it goes through, burns battery very quickly. So if you, always activate it if you can, excuse me, but if you're on very low battery, just understand it may not actually get a satellite lock at that point.
Now, I'll just double check in the last question there is Mitchell Wells' question about the Garmin InReach.
Yep, so it's come to there, much any great disadvantage. Yeah, so just real quick, yeah, the only disadvantage with that one as well with the Zoleos that, yeah, it does go through that third party, but RE emergencies, Zoleo centers. Yep, I believe the Android does too, over satellite. Not 100% sure, so we can get back to you on that one, but I know iPhone does, so I would assume Android would have followed suit.
Okay, that looks like all of the questions there. Just from Manara, is there any way of watching a recorded version of this webinar as I only just joined? Yes, there will be a recorded version available both on the Pilot Safety Hub under non-controlled operations and also on the CASA YouTube channel, which is CASA Briefing.
Cool.
No trouble at all. Well, folks, thank you very much for joining us online today. And again, thank you to Michael as well for your assistance and expertise in today's webinar. And I hope everyone's had a good session discussing SARTIME ELTs and the safety benefits that we can get from equipment that maybe is something we don't really consider or things we don't take the time to talk about. And as I mentioned, we'll wrap it up there, and the recording will be available on the Pilot Safety Hub. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Have a great afternoon.
Cheers for that.
There's one last one there from Craig. Michael, any advice for aircraft tasked to search for other aircraft or vessels while everyone's leaving?
Yeah, if anyone's still listening to that, and hopefully you're still here as well for that question. Any advice that we give, we can provide that over the phone, but I guess, or at least any by ATS. But we would recommend a search height if you can achieve it between 200 and 500 feet. If you're already flying at that level, that'd be great. The lower the better is what we're looking for. Normally, sometimes a person in the water or a stricken vessel, which can be quite hard to spot if you're too high. So if you can get down to about 200 to 500 feet, that's what we recommend as you overfly.